Kumar. I'm the Communications Associate at the Institute for College Access and Success. Thank you all for joining us joining us here in our webinar, Understanding Net Price Calculators and Financial Aid Offers. Just want to give you all a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button, and we'll answer the questions at the end of everybody's presentation. But feel free to ask them along the way. And before handing it off to Lindsay, I'm going to go over the Institute for College Access and Success. We work in both California and nationally to increase awareness and reduce the burden of student loan debt, to improve access to available aid, strengthen need-based grant programs, and to protect students, borrowers, and taxpayers.
All right, hello everyone, this is Lindsay. Glad you could join us today to talk about some key consumer information tools in higher education. With so many students needing to borrow loans to access and complete college, it really is more important than ever to provide students with relevant, clear, timely information to help them decide where to go to college and how to pay for it. And today we're going to hear from experts who focus on key consumer information tools that can really support students and families' college decision-making process. TCAS has long focused on improving consumer information tools as one important piece of supporting student success and ensuring that students and families have the information they need to find the right college fit. We're really thrilled to have some great partners join this webinar today to share more information about two of these tools. Dr. Laura Perna and Jeremy Wright Kim from the University of Pennsylvania's Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy are going to talk about net price calculators, which can provide users with an individualized estimate of how much a college would cost well before they have to decide where to apply and without needing to complete the FAFSA. Then we'll turn it over to Sophie Ewing and Wesley Whistle from New America to discuss financial aid offer communications, sometimes called award letters, which are the primary way students receive information about their actual aid offers and first learn how much a college they've been accepted to will actually cost them. Finally, before wrapping up, we'll have some time for some question and answer, as Angelica mentioned, so make sure to type in your questions in the Q&A chat box and to submit so that we can field those questions. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Laura Perna and Jeremy Wright Kim to talk about net price calculators.
Great, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. I want to begin, starting on the next slide by just talking a little bit about the broader context in which this work is situated. So we all know how important higher education is to the well-being of individual participants, and it's so important to our society as well. But as we also know, there's tremendous inequity embedded within our system, and just want to take a minute to show one of the many different slides that really document the extent to which the opportunity to enroll in and benefit higher education varies across groups. So here you see that just 15% of students who were high school sophomores in 2002 achieved a bachelor's degree within 8 years of graduating high school. By comparison, 60% of students who were in the highest quartile of SES achieved a bachelor's degree or more. These are really big differences. Of course, we know that many forces contribute to these differences in attainment. As you can see on the next slide, one force that plays a role is the extent to which folks have accurate and complete information about college costs and then how they're going to pay them. This slide comes from a recent report from the U.S. Department of Education, and it shows the percentage of ninth graders who are over and underestimating the cost of 1 year of tuition and mandatory fees at public four-year colleges in their state. And here you can see that across racial ethnic groups, a considerable share of students are both overestimating the cost of tuition and as well, a considerable share are underestimating the cost. Both of those different behaviors could have some problematic implications for students and their families' ability to plan for college costs and make decisions about college going. On the next slide, one of the challenges is that, really what is the right question we should be asking to understand what students know about college costs. And our system is complicated. So tuition, as we know, is just one other types of cost of attendance. There are other important costs that have to be considered if students and their families are going to appropriately plan for how they're going to pay for college. And then another complexity is that many students do not pay the sticker price. So the net price for many students is the cost of attendance reduced by some amount of grants. On the next slide, we've outlined some of the many challenges that are involved in trying to estimate in advance how much a particular student will actually pay to go to college. So we have variations across colleges and universities in what tuition and fees as published are. There are variations across institutions in the availability of different types of financial aid. There are variations in the criteria for awarding different types of aid. There are also variations in individual circumstances. So how much grant aid a student will get will depend on their family income and their other financial resources. And the financial aid package may vary based on characteristics of enrollment, like full-time or part-time status, major field, and residence. Complicating all this, of course, is the absence of college-related assistance in many high schools. And this is from a national report, on average 470 students per counselor at public schools. On the next slide. So one of the few mechanisms actually that's available for students and families as well as school counselors to use to try to get a sense of what the net price of going to college will be is the net price calculator. So one of the advantages of the net price calculator is that students and families or school counselors can enter into these net price calculators information about a student's financial circumstances and get some prediction about how much their individual estimated net price will be without having to complete the FAFSA. The federal government has recognized that this is important, through the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008. All institutions that receive Title IV aid are supposed to have a net price calculator on their websites that meet certain requirements. And with that, I'm going to transition to Jeremy, who will tell you about our study.
Thank you, Laura. So as Laura mentioned, given the importance of the net price calculator and the requirement at the federal level, the team at Penn Ahead recently built off of prior research, including a report by our colleagues at TICAS, to not only explore institutional compliance with the legislation and the regulations that are laid out at the federal level, but also to understand the usefulness and usability of cost-related information provided by specifically institutional net price calculators, but also across cost-related websites. And we did so from the perspective of a potential low-income student, recognizing that that's the population that could benefit most from this type of information. So to do that, we examined the output of net price calculators and information on cost-related websites for 40 public and 40 private not-for-profit four-year institutions. And we did so by creating a profile for a low-income student that importantly varied on two characteristics: on dependence, so a dependent or an independent student, and then by GPA, so that we could test an NPC's responsiveness to the variation in that characteristic. As the next slide shows, we identified three common types of calculators in our analyses. First, the federal template, which is provided by the Department of Education. Second, what we identified as a vendor template, so a third-party company that an institution could work with to implement a tool. And then finally, an institutional template. So these were net price calculators that they weren't the federal template, we couldn't identify a vendor, and so an institution could have built their own calculators. And these three types of calculators, it's important to highlight because a large portion of the variation in the usefulness and usability of information across our samples stems from which calculator an institution uses. Predominantly, the length of the NPC and the amount of information required varies. So for example, the federal template averages about 7 to 9 questions. Other calculators can ask as much as 70 questions. And while that may be that impacts the student experience, it also impacts the type of information that can be provided, such as the type of aid or the amount of detail provided. On the next slide, it outlines some additional findings of usefulness and usability in our study. So first, multiple calculators were difficult to find or non-functioning. Enhancements suggested in the Prosper Act and the Net Price Calculator Improvement Act would standardize the location of these tools and make them easier to find. Second, 22% of the institutions included additional tools in addition to the net price calculator. So this took the form of scholarship calculators, tuition calculators, and importantly, the majority of the time they provided estimates that were conflicting in information. Around a third of our calculators failed to highlight or calculate the federally defined net price, limiting the transferability and comparability across tools for students. And they had uneven intention to providing estimates that reflect student circumstances. So only a little more than half of our sample asked merit-related questions, which limited the tool's ability to actually estimate varying awards based on our achievement profile. So only 28 awarded more aid to our high-achieving dependent profile, so that getting a 3.5 GPA compared to a 2.5. They also were limited in their ability to estimate different costs and aid for independent versus dependent students, and assessing differentiation based on citizenship status. And finally, less than half of the NPCs provided direct contact information or directed a student intentionally somewhere where they could answer questions that they might have based on the estimates that were provided to them. Next, we'd like to show you some examples, specific examples from institutions in our sample based on some outputs. And so what we see here is an example of the federal output. Throughout our sample, 77 used the net price calculator label, which was required by law. However, 7 institutions called it something else, different pages, making it possibly difficult for a student to navigate to. Only 29 of our schools used 2017 or 2018-19 data. 37 disaggregated by source. So as you can see here for the federal template, it provides one lump sum of grant aid, possibly making it difficult for a student to estimate which awards they may actually be eligible for. And although disaggregation of aid by source is not required by the HEOA, it is suggested in other legislation. And finally, only 37 institutions noted specifically to whom the estimates apply. In this example, it's only for a first-time, full-time degree-seeking undergraduate student taking 15 credits during the semester. Often, this information is in a footnote, as it was in the federal template, and may be hard for a student to find. The next slide shows another example that we came across. So, importantly, all institutions in our sample for which we could calculate a net price output included direct and indirect costs somewhere in their output. However, in this example, as you can see in this gray box, it wasn't always presented in addition to the rest of the information on the main output. And so originally, the small gray box, which is highlighted as the federal net price disclosure, is actually in the footnotes of this estimate. Whereas, as you can see on the left, in the yellow highlighted direct net cost, which is one version of a net price, it's incorrectly calculated as it only includes direct costs. 26 of the institutions in our sample did not highlight the appropriate net price. And then you see further down in this sample, in the green outlined estimate, this is another net price calculation. However, it's also incorrectly calculated as it includes loans. Throughout our sample, 44 institutions included loan amounts. However, 12 listed them as aid, didn't differentiate them from grant aid, and only a few noted that loans must actually be repaid. On the next slide, you'll see another example here. Important to note in this example, though not required, the Prosper Act suggests that estimating costs by student major would be useful for students to get a more accurate estimate of what they may spend. This institution does so by identifying higher costs for students pursuing nursing. Only 9 institutions in our sample noted that costs could be different based on major or student choices. 73 institutions referenced work study as a possible way for students to address the remaining costs of their net price. However, only 9 of them actually included a definition of work study, meaning the student actually knew that they had to work to get their money. And finally, and most concerningly, here the estimated net price in this calculator is estimated at $0, but that's because the institution includes a Parent Plus loan, which can be used to borrow up to the cost of attendance, meaning this is a particularly misleading, potentially misleading estimate for students. The next slide shows an example of an output that meets not only all of the current federal requirements, but many of the suggestions. It uses current cost data. It disaggregates all sources of cost and aid. It highlights with the arrow what the appropriate net price is. And then it still includes information related to work study and loan options, but it doesn't include them in the actual estimation of net price. On the next slide You'll also see that it provides direct information for contact information for a student to access any answers that they may have. And it also provides a glossary of information, whereas other NPCs may have included a work study amount. This is an example of an institution that has a definition, for example, to show what that actually means for a student.
Great. And so we have some additional information available on our website called Questioning the Calculations that really summarizes our findings and offers some one-page tip sheets for various different stakeholders based on our study. This is a screenshot of the one-page statement that we have for federal policy. And so these recommendations really focus on trying to identify some of the recommendations that come from our study. These recommendations build on the good work that TICAS has previously done on this area. Just a couple of things to note. We have so much inconsistency in how we talk about cost-related information, and even the U.S. Department of Education uses terms pertaining to cost-related issues inconsistently. And so anything that can be done, I think, to help ensure that we're consistently using words to refer to the same thing is a big help. We also have some recommendations about some modifications to the federal template that are summarized here. On the next slide, we offer some recommendations for colleges and universities. And, as Jeremy mentioned, our study is really trying to look at these tools as a really potentially important or useful mechanism for low-income students and their families as they try to understand, is there an institution, what are my costs going to be if I attend a particular institution? And so our recommendations really fall into several categories. We're urging more transparency in what the total current costs will be, so using current data, disclosing assumptions about those costs, being clear about the mechanisms to pay costs, especially important is differentiating and making clear to students the differences between loans and grants, and then providing information that helps students make sense of all this. One of the things that we haven't mentioned is we also looked at institutional websites about college costs, and one of the related issues here is making sure that information about costs that's on the net price calculator aligns with other information on other cost-related websites. And with that, I will hand it over to Sophie and Wesley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, Perna, and Jeremy, for the amazing work that you have done in net price calculators. And hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Ewing. I'm the Program Associate for the Higher Education Initiative at New America. And today I will be presenting with my colleague, Wesley Wisto, the Senior Advisor for Policy and Strategy at the Education Program at New America. And before we start, I just want to give a little bit of information about who we are and what we do. So New America is a non-partisan think tank in Washington, D.C., and we work on a wide range of policy issues ranging from international security to education and technology. And the education policy program is actually one of the biggest programs at New America, and our work touch on the whole spectrum of education, from early childhood to higher education and workforce development. And today, Wesley and I will present the research that New America and US5, which is a nonprofit that works in college access and affordability, in which we conducted our research in financial aid offer. And the next slide. As a long-term advocate for transparent communications of financial aid offers, we believe that the work matters because full communication of financial aid, such as the failure to differentiate between grant and loans, or the failure to tell the student the full cost of attendance, can lead to consequences that can threaten the long-term financial health of the student. And are not fully understand the full cost of attendance can also put the student at risk of dropping out, which is a major predictor of default. And in 2017,
So the next slide, in 2017, New America and USY, we examined a set of more than 11,000 award letters in which we look at their financial aid package, and from the set of 11,000 award letters, we narrowed it down to 515 letters when we did a more close review of their formatting practice, and that is the focus of the presentation today. So in the next slide, you will see an example of a financial aid offer from our report. So typically, a financial aid offer will have three main components. First, the list of the aid package, which includes grant and scholarship, loans, and work study that students are eligible for. Second, it will list cost information, which will include the cost of attending the college and any remaining cost calculations. Last but not least, it will tell the student what they need to do next now that the financial aid is offered. And from our reviewing of the letters, we see that the practice of listing these three components are vary across colleges. So in the next slide, you see the first problem that we found is the inconsistent and confusing jargon and terminology that colleges use. So for example, our 455 colleges that listed federal direct unsubsidized loans, they listed it in 136 unit way, which means they use different terms to call federal direct unsubsidized loans. More concerning are those letters that didn't say loan in full or didn't even say loan at all. So if you go to the next, yes, this is an example of the letters in our samples, and you see in these letters, federal direct subsidized loan is called direct unsubsidized L, and then the word loan is also abbreviated in like LOA or LO. So in the next slide, as cost as the previous presentations by Dr. Perna and Jeremy shows, cost is one of the most important information that students need to know in deciding where to go to college. But cost information is left out in more than a third of the letter in our samples. For those that listed cost, the practice is varied. So there's a letter that listed the full cost of attendance, which includes direct and indirect cost, and there's also letters that only listed direct cost. So in the next slide, yeah. So for example, in this letters, it's listed that only the direct cost of the which includes tuition and fees and room and board that the student has to pay directly to college. Listing only direct costs makes the offer look more generous than it actually is, and student and family may not be able to immediately realize like the other costs that may incur during the time of studying. The next slide is another problem we found with the letter in the sample. So typically, an aid package would have three types of aid. Grant and scholarships are money that the student don't have to repay. Loans are money that students have to repay with interest, and work study are the money that students are eligible to earn once they're on campus. And we think that given the differences in the nature of the type of aids, these should be listed separately and under their own heading. But in fact, this is actually not what colleges are doing. 70% of the letters in our sample presented all aids lumped together. So for example, you go to the next slide. Like in this letter, A's items are not listed based on their type, but based on alphabetical orders. So as you can tell, it starts with a few grants, and then comes a few loans, and then grants, and then work study, and finally loans again. So listing listing a item this way can cause confusion to student and family to identify. So what money actually is given to them and what money they actually need to repay. The next slide is not a concerning practice we found in a lot of letters. It is the way that financial aid offers is now treating parent plus loan. So parent plus loan is completely different from student loan. It's the loan provided by federal government to the parents, and it comes with different terms and conditions, and doesn't have the same protections that student loan has, in that it is not qualified for most of the income-driven repayment plans. And but like in a lot of the letters we found in our samples, we found that parent plus loan is treated as a line item, just like other student loans. For example, in this letter, parent plus loan is listed directly after subsidized and unsubsidized loans. And in this letter, it doesn't even say this is a parent loan. So like the student, if they just look at the letter, look at this letter, there's no way for them to tell this is a loan for parent, not for them. And what is more concerning with this letter is that if you look at at the end of the letter, when we circle red, the total unmet need is listed as 0, which makes the letters look so, the offer is so generous, but in fact, this is already packages more than $10,000 of loans per semester. Next slide. So a quite critical information that most students need to know is that also how much they still need to pay or how much they still owe after the financial aid is offered. But like most of the letters are not showing the student the remaining amount after all aids are taken into consideration. And for those that show the remaining amount that do the calculations for the student, they do so very inconsistently. So for example, in this, can you go to the next slide? In this letter, the remaining cost is calculated by subtracting all the total aid offer, including loans, from the total cost of attendance. Other letters that it start the calculations with the direct cost and subtract the total aids, including loan, or just subtract the amount grant. So given the very inconsistent bottom line calculations, it's really hard for students to make apple-to-apple comparisons between like offers from different colleges. The next slide, last but not least, is the lack of next steps. So now that the offers is received, a lot of the aid will not be offered until some next step will have to be done. And a lot of letters in the sample didn't tell students what to do next. And even though that did, the practice again is very different. And with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague Wesley. He will tell us about the policy recommendations that coming out of the report and any momentum that happened after the report was released.
Thanks, Sophie. So because we are a think tank working on policy, of course, this research led to many different policy recommendations, which are listed here. So we believe that there should be written financial aid offers to all students. There should be standardized terms and student-friendly definitions so students can make informed decisions and easily make apples-to-apples comparisons across institutions. We think that cost of attendance must be included, and it needs to break down direct costs and indirect expenses. Grants and scholarships that do not need to be repaid should be separated from loans that have to be repaid. Parent Plus loans and work study should not be line items. As Sophie was pointing out earlier, Parent Plus loans are neither guaranteed, and they're very different from grants and scholarships. Parent Plus loans must be qualified for, parents are the borrowers, and then work study must be earned and is subject to availability of funds and how much a student works. We believe that the remaining amount needed to cover costs must be calculated for students. And then critical next steps must be identified so students know who to contact and how to accept or decline their offers, especially around loans. On the next slide, please, thank you. So because of this research, we've seen a lot of momentum building for policy change. The research received a lot of important and major press coverage that highlighted the findings and the problems. Senator Alexander, the chair of the Senate Health Committee, laid out his priorities this spring for higher ed, and he acknowledged that while previously he didn't think this was an issue, the research showed him that he was wrong and that something needed to be done. The Treasury Department even also recently released some recommendations for financial aid offers, and it included many of the ones from our report. The Understanding the True Cost of College Act is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that has been introduced every year since 2012. This Congress, the bill was changed significantly based on the findings and recommendations of this report. And this new version has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. And as of this morning, I think it has 9 co-sponsors in each chamber. Additionally, Senator Alexander even introduced a package last week of bills to reform the Higher Education Act. And while we, of course, think that a comprehensive reauthorization is best, we were very excited to see a version of this bill included in his proposal. So as Congress considers reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, we're excited to see folks on the Hill realize this issue and that it is one that needs to be fixed. And we're hoping to see that any past legislation will include this bill. And I'll just add, though, of course, I don't work on state policy. It's also great to see certain states like Iowa, New York, New Jersey, and I believe California have done something to address this issue. So with that, I'll turn it back to Lindsay for Q&A.
Thanks, Wesley. Wow, we heard a lot of information there. So hopefully folks were able to digest that. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to type us your question, and we'll do our best to answer that. Just so you know, this is being recorded, so we will post this session on the internet, so you'll be able to go back and refer to it later. But we're eager to hear your questions, and we'll give some time for those to come in if there are any. And if there's not, I have myself some questions for our presenters. So I'll jump in while we're waiting for more questions. Turning back to the net price calculators, I'm wondering if our presenters there can speak to some of the barriers. You had a lot of good information about ways that current net price calculators are falling short of providing very consistent information and accurate information to students. What are some of the barriers in your estimation of getting colleges to implement the recommendations you're suggesting, like disclosing, for example, that loans are optional?
Great question. I think there's probably several things going on. So, one of our findings has to do with the extent to which institutions are providing current data or data that reflect past years. And, so we point out the high percentage of institutions that are using out-of-date data. That would seem to be a relatively easy thing for institutions to fix. But it requires really vigilance by institutions to have a process in place to make sure that they're regularly updating that information. The findings with regard to the presentation of information, I think institutions should really look carefully at this. And it's very interesting, I think, the many parallels in the types of presentations we're seeing with the net price calculators and with the financial aid offer letters. there are consistent practices across both of those different mechanisms that really provide misleading information to students. And so I think more care has to be put into just thinking about what are the types of information that students need to have, especially students who are from low-income families or first in their families to go to college. What's the information that they need in order to really make sense of the information that's being provided? It's really complicated, especially when you have so many different types of loans and grants and things like that. You know, it's certainly institutions have many priorities. Providing useful, usable, accurate, transparent information should be one of those priorities. You know, we recognize that institutions are also trying to recruit a class and encourage students to apply and enroll, but it does no one any good if students and their families are proceeding to apply and enroll if they don't really understand how much it's going to cost.
Thanks, Laura. That's really important information to keep in mind here, just underscoring the importance of clear and reliable consumer information across all of these tools. And one thing I heard from across both of the presentations was this idea of standardized terms, that terms are so important and that different schools might be using a similar term, but meaning something really different. And we heard that with regard to the financial aid offer communications as well. And I'm wondering if, you know, we heard the recommendation to employ standardized terms and really student-friendly definitions across aid offer communications. What are some, I'm hoping either Wesley or Sophie can speak to some of the other opportunities and maybe even challenges for going further than that and requiring all schools using a standard aid offer communication itself rather than just standardizing terms?
Yeah, so I think one of the pushbacks that colleges and universities would say is that that everyone very much thinks they're unique and have their very own special, maybe it's a scholarship or something that they have to provide, and so it's hard to fit into a standardized letter or something. And they also schools also want flexibility. I think that one of the things is, with the bill that Understanding the True Cost of College Act, it provides, they're still allowed to provide additional communication. So they would be required to have a universal letter, but then if they want to provide other communication explaining more about the details of the scholarship or something, and design it in a way in which that they prefer, they're given that too. I think we believe and we know that standardized terms and student-friendly definitions are critical for students to make those comparisons between schools, and it's critical for them to make informed decisions. So I think the opportunity is that it provides them a lot of flexibility, which is good in they're providing additional information. And we've seen certain universities who have tried to use standardized terms but also create a letter in their own formatting way too.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Can you speak also about both presenters talked about next steps. So the information at hand is important, and we heard ways to improve each of these tools. But when we're looking at something like an aid offer communication, what's the most important next step that should be included on that aid offer to make the best use of that information?
So it's a great question. Part of this, our research in financial aid offers, we also conducted focus group and also convening with different stakeholders, including students, financial aid administrator, and also college counselor. We found that three things that would be important would be necessary to include in the next step are first, any deadline in terms of accept or decline any aid that the student needs to know. Second, the information for any information, whether it's the portal that a student needs to go to accept or decline these aid, and any information related to accepting or declining the aid. And third is a specific contact point for assistance. So it turned out that even though we have a perfectly designed offers, the students still need a lot of assistance in identify what they need to do, identify what different terms mean. So having a specific contact point will be very helpful for them.
Thanks, Sophie. Final question, and if anybody else has any questions, make sure to enter them in the question and answer box. Otherwise, we'll wrap up after this question. But we heard a little bit about the Understanding the True Cost of College Act, which would make some changes and requirements around standardization for aid offer communications. You mentioned, Laura and Jeremy, a bill that would maybe make an impact on improving net price calculators. Can you talk a little bit about that bill, what changes that would make, and what kind of support across the aisle it might have?
Yeah, so when we were looking at our project at that time, there were two related bills, so the Prosper Act and the Net Price Calculator Improvement Act, that had bipartisan support as far as we could tell. And ultimately, what both pieces of legislation would have done would have been to, in addition to maintaining the requirements that are outlined in the Higher Education Opportunity Act for institutions to have net price calculators and to specify the type of information they have to have, it would have really, both pieces of proposed legislation got at some of these issues of usability and usefulness. And so some of them were structural suggestions that the net price calculator be located in a prominent space, that the actual net price on the output is the largest, the most identified cost estimate that's on that page so that students are directed to the right information. As I mentioned earlier, some of it was about being more disaggregated, more specific in the type of cost, the type of aid that's estimated. So rather than one lump sum requiring that these are disaggregated by aid, that they're more responsive to student and reflective to student circumstances. So can we get costs disaggregated by major discipline, for example? So a lot of the things that we highlighted as potential barriers to the usability and usefulness of these tools would ostensibly have been addressed in both pieces of legislation.
Okay, and if I could just add, I think it's really important to recognize that, there is federal legislation right now for institutions to have a net price calculator, and even with the requirements that are in place, colleges and universities, not all colleges and universities are meeting those requirements. So I hope that one of the takeaways from our presentation, as well as the great work by New America and New Aspire, is that these things really matter. They're the only tools out there really for folks to get a sense of how much they might expect to pay with the net price calculator or what the offer is from an institution. So colleges and universities really have to do better, I think, if students and their families are going to have the information that they need to make informed decisions.
That's such an important point. Thank you for putting a real underline on that. And I think also speaks to the variability and we're always going to see when institutions are in, have a lot of authority to give information in what way that they see fit. There's, of course, benefits to that, being able to tailor communications to things that are available at each institution, but at the same time, to think through the trade-offs of comparability and the degree to which students can see apples-to-apples information across different schools at different points in their college search career. With that, I think we will wrap up. I'm going to toss it back to Angelique to close out here, and thank you all for participating. Thank you to our experts for joining and sharing your research and perspective. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lindsay. Stay tuned for our next CSAL webinar. It's in October. Federal grants, loans, and repayment options. As Lindsay said earlier, this webinar was recorded, so we'll be sending it to all of the participants who joined in today, as well as all of those who RSVP'd. You can also find a copy of this video on our website, tcas.org. But if you have further questions, please feel free to contact our individual panelists. Here are their contacts. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, speakers. And we'll see you at our next webinar.